Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging into some fascinating source material. It's all centered around Marcus Garvey.
Yes, a truly pivotal figure. And the main source we're looking at is Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, which was compiled by John Henrik Clarke, working with Amy Jock Garvey herself.
Right, so it's not just a straightforward biography.
Not at all. It's like a mosaic, isn't it? You get essays, historical bits, Garvey's own writings.
Gives you different angles.
Exactly. Multiple perspectives on this hugely influential man and his legacy in, 20th century Black history.
So our mission here is to unpack all of that, kind of distill the key insights, understand the context, the successes, the controversies too.
Absolutely. It's all in there. We want to really get a handle on Garvey's vision for African people worldwide, using what these sources tell us.
And hopefully you'll find some unexpected details, maybe a few aha moments along the way. It's complex stuff.
It really is. So where do we start? Maybe with the backdrop.
Yeah, good idea. Let's set the stage. Because Garvey didn't just appear in a vacuum. The sources show this long history going right back of Africans brought here as slaves searching for an identity.
Right. That forced separation from Africa, the trauma. It triggered this immediate need to figure out who they were in this new hostile place.
And it wasn't passive. There was resistance from the very beginning.
Definitely. You see mentions of early slave revolts like Kefi and Berbice, Guyana.
And the Haitian Revolution, of course. Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines. Monumental figures.
Huge assertions of autonomy. But also, more locally, the constant struggle for freedom escaping North Canada, building the abolition movement.
But even with abolition, the question remained, what next? And that's where some of these ideas about maybe going elsewhere, maybe back to Africa, start to surface more strongly.
And you get these really interesting early figures pushing for Black advancement, and sometimes, that return to Africa.
Like Prince Hall in Boston.
Exactly. Founding the African Lodge, pushing for schools, fighting against kidnapping, working against the slave trade itself, all while America is fighting its own revolution.
And John B. Russwurm, one of the first Black college grads in the U.S., started a newspaper, then became involved in founding Liberia.
Peter Ogden, setting up the Oddfellows Lodge for Black people. And the sources really stress how many key figures, even before the Civil War, were West Indian immigrants contributing to Afro-American progress.
It shows this Africa consciousness, as the book calls it, emerging quite early, late 18th century even.
Yeah, people were thinking about Africa, writing about it. It wasn't just about survival in America. It was about connection, identity, maybe a future.
Which brings us to the American Colonization Society.
Right. And the sources make it clear that Black leaders were divided on that. Some saw potential, maybe. But figures like Frederick Douglass were deeply skeptical about its motives.
And then you have someone amazing like Paul Cuff.
Oh, yeah. A free Black man, father was enslaved. He actively seeks an African name, rejecting Slocum.
And then he doesn't just talk about it, he does something. Sails his own ship, the Traveler, to Sierra Leone.
And pays for 38 Black people to emigrate in 1812. That's incredible self-reliance, a powerful statement.
So all these threads are simmering for a long, long time. Resistance, building institutions, this growing connection to Africa.
And the idea of Pan-Africanism, uniting the whole diaspora, it really starts to take shape later. And interestingly, it originates in the West.
With that first Pan-African conference in London, 1900.
Organized by H. Sylvester Williams, a lawyer from the West Indies. That event literally put Pan-African on the map.
W.E.B. Du Bois was there too, representing a different strand of thought.
Right. But the sources note, while it got attention, the colonial powers Britain mainly were polite but non-committal. It showed the challenge of this diaspora-born idea gaining traction on the continent itself, at least initially.
Okay, that's a great setup. So into this world comes Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica, 1887.
And Jamaica at that time already had its own movements, brewing calls for reform, land ownership issues.
His early life seems pretty formative. Involved in a printer strike.
Yeah, got him involved in labor issues early on, worked for the government printing office, even edited a paper called The Watchman. He saw the struggles of working people firsthand.
And his travels, those seem absolutely crucial.
Transformative, absolutely. He goes to Costa Rica, sees the terrible conditions of Black workers on the plantations.
And tries to do something about it.
He protests to the British consul, but basically gets brushed off. Bureaucratic indifference, a hard lesson about colonial power.
And he traveled elsewhere in the region too, right? Central South America.
Yeah, he kept trying to organize, start papers, but faced constant pushback from authorities.
In England, That seems like a really key period.
Definitely. He connects with Dusé Muhammad Ali.
The Egyptian nationalist, publisher of the African and Orient Review.
That's the one. Used the slogan, Africa for the Africans. Garvey worked with him, and importantly, he met African and West Indian seamen in London.
Hearing their stories.
Exactly. Stories of suffering, discrimination all over the world. It hammered home this idea of a shared global black struggle.
And the sources describe this specific moment on the ship back to Jamaica.
His doom, as he put it, of being a race leader dawned on him.
After talking to someone returning from Basutoland.
Yeah, hearing these horrible and pitiable tales about life for Africans on the continent. It all coalesced: the exploitation in the Americas, the suffering in Africa.
And that sparks the idea for the UNIA.
Within days of landing back in Jamaica, August 1st, 1914, he founds the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Communities Imperial League, the UNIA.
With that famous motto, one God, one aim, one destiny.
And grounding it in scripture, too, from Acts. He created of one blood all nations of man to dwell on the face of the earth.
Interestingly, the sources say the initial goals included promoting unity among the races, seeking help from cultured white people.
Yeah, that initial framing is quite striking compared to his later, more race-first stance.
So what changed?
Well, according to Garvey's perspective in the sources, a big turning point was the pushback he got in Jamaica itself, specifically from the lighter-skinned, colored middle class.
The identity politics aspect.
Right. He felt they looked down on him, resisted being classified as Negroes, and actively opposed his organizing efforts. He saw that rejection as a major catalyst for his shift towards a more radical, race-focused approach. The sources really highlight that internal class and color tension.
So he starts in Jamaica, faces some local resistance,
Mm-hmm.
but the real explosion happens when he comes to the U.S.
Absolutely. He arrives in 1916, and the timing, oh, well, you couldn't have planned it better, almost.
Post-World War I America.
Exactly. A pressure cooker. Intense racism. The KKK is resurgent. Black soldiers are coming back from fighting for democracy abroad to face, lynchings and discrimination at home.
Plus the Great Migration.
Huge factor. Black communities are swelling in northern cities, especially Harlem. People are looking for new answers, new leadership, new hope.
And there were already different ideas out there. Bishop Henry McTeal Turner had pushed the Back to Africa idea earlier, mainly in the rural South.
Right, questioning if Black people even had a future in America. Then you had Booker T. Washington focusing on vocational training, economic self-help within the system.
And Du Bois focusing on civil rights, political action, the talented 10th.
Garvey comes into this mix, but he speaks directly to the masses, the urban working class. His message of independence, self-reliance, taking control of your own destiny, it just hit a nerve.
And the impact in Harlem was massive.
Immediate. The UNIA didn't just sign people up. The sources say it ignited this deep sense of race consciousness, self-dignity, in a way the more intellectual movements hadn't quite reached among everyday people. It changed the whole vibe, the political energy in Harlem.
And a huge part of that appeal was economic, which leads to the Black Star Line.
Yes.
Yeah.
Described in the sources as a great and sublime conception.
More than just a shipping company.
Oh, absolutely. It was a symbol. Black ownership, Black commerce on the world stage, writing Black people into the story of global trade.
Those slogans were powerful. Help float more ships.
What white men have done, colored men can do. It tapped right into that desire for respect, for self-sufficiency, race patriotism, you could call it.
The core idea being that economic power was the key.
Exactly. The sources emphasize this belief. Build Black wealth, and that will force other nations to respect you, to grant you justice.
Okay, so the vision is incredible. The enthusiasm is massive.
Yeah.
But then comes the reality check. Running a shipping line is hard.
Extremely hard. And the sources detail just how difficult it was. I mean, take the first ship, the Yarmouth.
An old ship, wasn't it?
Very old. Over 30 years old, apparently used as a coal boat.
Yeah.
Bought for a reported $165,000. A huge sum then, but maybe only worth, $25,000. And it needed constant, expensive repairs just to sail.
And there are accounts, like from Captain Mulzac.
Right. His account paints a picture of operational chaos. Delayed trips, huge financial losses, sky-high maintenance. He talks about one trip to Cuba where a strike just stranded the ship, costing a fortune.
It wasn't just leaky ships and bad luck, though. There were internal problems mentioned.
Big time. Critics like Du Bois were already pointing fingers at mismanagement, maybe even dishonesty.
And Garvey himself acknowledged issues.
Yeah, the sources include his own accounts of problems, a secretary who couldn't account for, $50,000 in stock sales, a treasurer accused of theft, a terrible cargo contract on the Yarmouth that basically guaranteed a loss.
Did he just think it was incompetence?
Not entirely. He seemed convinced that some of his own people were being bribed or manipulated by enemies. White business interests, Wall Street, maybe even competitors like the United Fruit Company who didn't want a black shipping line succeeding.
Which all leads up to the mail fraud trial.
The tipping point. Garvey and 4 others indicted. His perspective from the sources is that the trial was fixed. He even felt his own lawyers were working against him.
That's why he defended himself.
Famously, yes. He took over his own defense.
And the evidence that convicted him. The sources mention something specific.
According to Garvey's account, it boiled down to an empty envelope. Just an empty envelope with a black starline rubber stamp, mailed to someone who then turned it over. He argued anyone could have gotten a stamp and done that.
But he was convicted.
Yes. 5-year sentence, he ended up serving about 2 years and 9 months.
And even after prison, he tried again with shipping.
He did. Launched the Black Cross Navigation and Trading Company, bought another ship, the SS General Goethals, renamed it the SS Booker T. Washington.
But that ran into trouble too.
Almost immediately. It got libeled, basically seized over a cargo dispute. Again, Garvey blamed enemies manipulating people involved.
So this grand economic dream, the Black Star Line, just got tangled up in so many practical, internal, and legal problems.
It really did. And beyond the business woes, Garvey was also clashing with other major black figures and groups.
Yeah, the sources mention that right from his arrival in the U.S., he saw the existing leadership as lacking.
He called them mere opportunists without real programs, according to the sources. That didn't exactly endear him to them.
And the conflict with Dubois is legendary.
It is. And the sources show Dubois' view evolving, initially seeing Garvey as sincere, maybe naive, but later becoming extremely critical.
Of the business practices.
Yes, also the rhetoric, the perceived threats, that controversial meeting with the KKK. Dubois saw Garvey's approach as ultimately harmful to the cause of black people in America.
And Garvey fired back just as hard.
Oh, absolutely. Accused Dubois of attacking any black leader who emerged, of having no program for the masses, of being too close to white patrons.
So it wasn't just personality.
No, the sources really frame it as a fundamental clash of strategies. Garvey's mass mobilization, race first, global vision, versus Dubois' focus on the talented 10th, civil rights, integration within the U.S., 2 different paths.
And there was also friction with the colored middle class, the mulatto group.
Yes, that tension we mentioned from Jamaica carried over. Garvey felt they resented being lumped in as Negroes, that they sought separation based on skin tone. It was a deep fault line.
Someone sued him for libel over it.
Cyril Briggs, yeah, a light-skinned editor. Garvey called him a white man publicly, and Briggs sued. Shows how charged that issue of identity was.
What about the communists?
Another complex relationship. Initially, some overlap in wanting to organize the masses, but the sources mention Garvey echoing a sort of cynical communist assessment that colored people were harder to organize politically, maybe born fools in terms of knowing their rights. Ultimately, they became critics, too.
The sources also touch on some of Garvey's own more controversial ideas, like racial purity.
Yes, his belief in a pure black race is mentioned, and that quote about wanting to square his conscience with his race later in life.
And the KKK meeting is noted as a major point of criticism.
Definitely. A critic cited in the sources alleges he met with the Klan and found common ground on racial separation. Understandably, for people fighting segregation and lynchings, that was deeply offensive and damaging. It highlights the kind of controversial tactics the sources say he sometimes considered.
So after all this incredible activity and conflict in the U.S., he gets deported in 1927, back to Jamaica.
But he doesn't just stop. He stays active politically there, forms a party, runs for office.
Though he didn't win.
No, he was actually disqualified from one election. But his platform, according to the sources, had some really progressive ideas. Worker insurance, minimum wages, supporting local industries, education reform, libraries, prison reform.
But the system was stacked against him.
Pretty much. Property qualifications meant most black Jamaicans couldn't vote, so his mass support couldn't easily translate into electoral power nationally.
And he still faced legal problems.
Yeah, got jailed for contempt of court and also for seditious libel because of critical articles in his newspaper, The Black Man. He kept challenging the authorities.
Then he moves back to London in the 30s.
Sets up a UNIA headquarters there, holds debates in Hyde Park, even tries to get a massive loan from the British government, but gets nowhere, really. Just politeness, no cash.
Then comes the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. That must have been huge.
Massive. It really galvanized Black people everywhere. A sense of outrage, solidarity. The sources call it a rebirth of Garveyism in a way.
But Garvey himself had a critical take.
Somewhat controversially, yes. While supporting Ethiopia, he was critical of what he saw as Emperor Haile Selassie's unpreparedness militarily, diplomatically. He also pointed to internal issues like serfdom, lack of education. He saw it as a wake-up call about the need for modernization and preparedness across the Black world.
And then, sadly, his death in London in 1940.
After suffering strokes, apparently made worse when he read a premature false report of his own death in a Black newspaper, a really tragic end.
So the movement peaked, then faced decline. Internal issues, external pressure.
A combination of both, absolutely. But the legacy, as the sources make abundantly clear, is just immense. It didn't vanish.
UNIA itself, still the biggest mass Pan-African movement ever.
By far. Nothing else has come close in terms of sheer numbers and global reach among ordinary people.
And that impact on consciousness.
Profound. Just awakening that sense of race, pride, self-worth. You see African independence leaders like Nkrumah saying Garvey's ideas were a key influence when they were students. UNIA branches and networks existed deep within Africa, too.
And the idea of economic independence, the Black Star Line. Even though it failed financially?
The idea itself, the sources call it great and sublime, that symbol of Black capability, Black ownership on a global scale, that resonated deeply and still does.
You can definitely see the links to later movements. Black power, Black is beautiful.
Absolutely. That emphasis on racial pride, self-definition, even his spiritual views supporting the African Orthodox Church, visualizing God as Black, was all part of integrating race pride into every aspect of life.
And that core belief never wavered, did it? That wealth and power were necessary for respect.
That seems central based on the sources. That you couldn't just ask for justice, you had to build the economic and political strength to command it.
So while the UNIA as a unified organization declined from its peak, the ideas persisted.
Yeah, the sources mention remnants, smaller groups carrying on aspects of the vision. The impact was just too widespread to disappear entirely. It fundamentally shifted the conversation.
So stepping back, looking at all this through the lens of these sources, Garvey is just such a complex figure.
Incredibly complex. Visionary leader, mobilized millions, no doubt, but also faced enormous opposition, external forces trying to crush him, yes, but also internal conflicts, maybe his own strategies or temperament contributing sometimes.
But his main contributions seem undeniable.
Absolutely. Igniting that mass consciousness, fostering that deep race pride, pushing relentlessly for economic self-sufficiency, and championing that grand vision of a united, independent Africa. Foundational stuff.
When you think about the context, these sources lay out the oppression, the search for identity. What do you think we can learn today from his fight? From the challenges he faced, both outside and inside the movement?
That's the big question, isn't it? How relevant is that struggle for identity, economic power, global solidarity today? And how do those challenges, the external pressures, the internal divisions, still play out in movements for liberation and empowerment now?
And maybe the most fundamental question that comes out of looking at Garvey through these sources.
Yeah.
It's that tension.
Exactly. The tension between fighting for equality within the existing systems
Versus building separate, independent, race-first power structures outside or alongside them.
Garvey's life, his movement, as documented here, it's just such a powerful, complicated, and I think essential case study for anyone grappling with that very question today.